popular beliefs. But I think I know a thing or two about this wonderful topic that we're going to be talking about. So yeah, for the next like 45 minutes, I'm going to be taking a deep dive into this interesting world of the Lazarus group, or the North Korean cyber forces. So a little bit about myself, Aaron, currently working at CrowdStrike. This is actually my 5th RootCon, so I'm very happy to be back here. For those of you who have submitted your CFPs for the conference, I may or may not have interacted with you, but this has always been a great experience to be here at RootCon, and 5th time here, 5th time speaking, very happy to be here. For those of you who have participated on the Day Zero training or the workshop I did with Scott yesterday, thank you very much for your participation and your interest. Hope to see you again at RootCon 20. So after I've done my RootCon pitch, so now we can go on into the content. Everybody knows this meme, right? And I think this describes the motivation for my topic today, because many of us, or if you are not as acquainted or familiar with the North Korean situation, right, there is this general notion of almost everything that comes from North Korea is known as Lazarus Group, right? For those of us who have been doing this for a long time, and over time, right, as more attacks happen, right, and because there's also a lack of visibility on understanding the actual North Korean forces, there tends to be this forced amalgamation, right, or forced attribution of everything that comes out from North Korea just is equated to the Lazarus Group. So I kind of wanted to take on this interesting subject because I've been looking at them for a while now, and want to kind of use this opportunity to unpack, right, North Korean cyber activity for this RootCon audience today. So these are the things I'm going to be talking about. I think we're going to begin with kind of like a short history of how DPRK has performed or behaved, right, in cyberspace, and then just like how I like to think about or unpack, right, a nation state. This is the general order that I do it with. So I'll kind of begin at a high level to help this crowd understand what drives like what they do. So understanding the why behind DPRK operations, and then spend some time talking about the structure and organization of DPRK, or as much as what we know today, right? Because that is really the meat of today's conversation, right? To unpack what is quote unquote the Lazarus Group. And then the 4th topic we're going to cover is just a snippet of what we have observed in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years. Because as with any adversary, the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures continue to evolve over time. It's the same situation with the DPRK. So I think picked 3 main themes to cover. This is not in any shape or form a comprehensive coverage of the North Korean current state of their tactics, techniques, and procedures. And there are many more experts in the crowd that can attest to that. And then we kind of finish off with kind of helping you think about, in your context today, whether are you working in an organization that's based in the Philippines or working in a particular sector, right? Help you think through what are some of the potential repercussions or implications you have to think about, right? If the DPRK could potentially be an adversary to your organization. So beginning with, what drives our dear friend there, right, to do anything that he does. Let's kind of, before we go into the interest, let's talk about what has transpired over time, right? So for those of you who have been doing this for a while now, you know that DPRK has quite a storied history when it comes to cyber attacks, right? I think the first well-known instance of DPRK attack is known as 11 Days of Rain. It happened between the 3rd to the 13th of March in 2011, right? So it's about 14 years ago now. And then the targets of this campaign, which was retrospectively known as 11 Days of Rain, they were primarily going after targets in South Korea. So going after non-classified military networks, the National Assembly websites, many of the websites of the major media companies, some level of banking infrastructure, right? And these attacks were deemed to be politically motivated because they came right after 2 big significant events in Korea, right? One was the Yongbyon Island bombing, and then the sinking of the naval ship known as Chonan, right? If you were reading the news at that point in time, I'm sure those pieces of news would have caught your eye, right? And this instance has largely been attributed or assessed to be one of the earliest demonstration of how the DPRK government is thinking about and experimenting with their offensive cyber capability. In this case, using it to harass, right, to spy on the South Korean government, right, but with some limited risks, right, with some limited calculus around potential retaliation. And then soon after came what was known as Duck Seoul, right, or largely also known as Operation Troy. This happened in March 20th, 2013, and this was directed at the media sector and the banking sector in South Korea. So if you are familiar with the Korean ecosystem, KBS, MBC, YTN were the media broadcasters that were hit, and then major banks like Jeju Bank, Shinhan Bank were hit by this attack. And this was one of the earliest on-record like wiper-type attacks that were conducted by the North Koreans. And again, right, it's geopolitically motivated because it happened during a time where there were heightened tensions on the Korean peninsula. A month just before this attack, North Korea just concluded their third nuclear test, and that third nuclear test actually caused a lot of international condemnation, right, because of the demonstration of a truly credible ICBM capability, right, during that test. And it also happened during, right, the joint exercise between the US forces and the South Korean military, right, Key Resolve or Foal Eagle, which is still happening today every year annually. And so this was like kind of like their act of protest, their act of retaliation. And then came this wonderful movie known as The Interview. Curious, anybody in the crowd actually watched this movie? Aha! Yeah, I watched it because of, I watched it almost in protest of what the North Koreans did in retaliation of this, right? And I don't know if you guys know this, the coverage or the viewership of the movie actually shot through the roof after the attacks, right? So if you know a thing or two, because of this wonderful movie, somebody got really unhappy, and then as a result, Sony Pictures Entertainment, right, the company behind this wonderful movie, got hit with, again, a wiper-type attack, right, in November 2014. And this was an interesting moment, not only to understand like the North Korean evolution, but to also understand holistically how cyber security has evolved, right? Because this was the first time the US went on press, right, went public, attributing the incident to North Korea. And it was also the first time that basically Barack Obama came out to say that, you know, this is not cool, right? And thereafter actually followed with sanctions. So this was the first time we saw on the international diplomacy front that there were actions taken against a state-on-state, right, cyber attack. And the last thing that was also interesting was that this kind of started the conversation around where does the line between public and private sector becomes, right, blur, right? Because this was a case where a public sector, the US government, was responding in kind to an attack that actually happened on the private sector in the US, right? So this was a watershed moment in many, many ways in the history of cybersecurity. Then came this wonderful thing known as the Lazarus heist. And I think many of you who have been doing cybersecurity, if you've been working in the financial sector in the Philippines, you may or may not would have heard of this incident, primarily because of how the only amount that was successfully cashed out and laundered, for better or for worse, happened in this country, right? So I don't think I need to talk about this any further. But what was interesting about this from an international perspective was that this was one of the most sophisticated and audacious attacks, right, that was financially motivated. Two things I want to talk about, right? First, it was clearly very deliberate, right? The North Koreans, in retrospect, right, were found to be observing, monitoring the SWIFT operations for months and understood how legitimate transactions were actually created and processed. And by doing so, they were actually then able to create very legitimate looking transaction messages to request, right, for the fund transfers. And because of this, there was that degree of truth, right, that convinced, right, the transactions to be processed. And what was really interesting was also how deliberate they were about the time that they used to deliver the attack. They actually leveraged the notion of the different time zones between the different countries and also the weekend. So what they did was they first sent out the request for the fund transfers late on Thursday night, local time, Asia time zone, right? Which was already early Friday morning in South Asia, which was already a weekend because Bangladesh is a Islamic nation, right? So it's a Sunday to Thursday work week. So they initiated the fund transfer on a weekend that was already in Bangladesh, right? So there was nobody physically sitting in the Central Bank of Bangladesh to actually vet the transfer or to stop the transfer. Right? And then by the time, because the funds were actually had to be approved by the bank in New York, by the time the transfers got to the Bank of New York, it was already Saturday, New York time, right? So it was the weekend in New York. And the money, because all the automation was happening and there was nothing to intervene the automation, the money actually showed up in the Philippines on Friday evening, local time in the Philippines. So basically the adversaries had the rest of the weekend in the Philippines to think about cashing out and then laundering the money within the casinos, within some of the casinos in this country. And all that happened, believe it or not, within the 48 hours of the weekend in the Philippines. So it was amazing, right? Amazing for better or for worse, but it showed the level of intentionality, the level of deliberate operations. Then after the Bangladesh bank heist came what is also, probably something you would have heard about if you were doing security for a while, right? The WannaCry ransomware. It was one of the largest and one of the most disruptive ransomware attacks in history. It was using Eternal Blue, right? One of the vulnerabilities that was actually unfortunately disclosed by the shadow brokers just like a month before. Right? So WannaCry used Eternal Blue a month after the disclosure by shadow brokers. Right? And this led to a massive spread of ransomware across the globe. Many organizations were hit. I believe the National Health Service in the UK was probably hit, one of the most badly hit victims. It led to hospitals having to cancel surgeries. The ambulances were not going to the right locations to save lives. So this was also one of the interesting moments in history where people started thinking about the human cost of ransomware attack. Right? And believe it or not, the North Koreans intended for this to be a financially motivated operation, right? But it clearly went out of control, right? So this was an interesting case of a nation state experimenting with tactics and techniques, right? That clearly failed the intended objective, but had a really terrible implication, right, on the global ecosystem. And then coming up from kind of like looking at where things were from the 2017 to where we are today, right, almost for the last 8 years now, right, is the unfortunate world of crypto, right? The DPRK folks continue to be very financially motivated in the way they perform their operations, and they go after, quote unquote, the path of least resistance, right? And cryptocurrencies, unfortunately, is right that least of path resistance, right? So they've been going after the exchange directly targeting protocols that are being used in the ecosystem, directly looking for vulnerabilities that exist within the infrastructure of the cryptocurrency exchanges, and going after direct theft of funds. And if you're wondering, this year is actually on record the most largest heist ever conducted in a single attack. So Bybit in I think February this year, in a single incident, 1.5 billion worth of funds in cryptocurrencies were stolen in one single attack. And this is ongoing. There are no signs of stopping. So now we have gone through that quick history lesson, right? I want to kind of pivot and start talking about what drives them, right? You already get a sense of, based on how the attack unfolded, I already alluded to some of the intent and the motivation of what drives them, but now we will spend some time exploring them in greater detail, right? First, because it is a highly authoritarian regime, right? Whatever the dear leader, or I don't know what's the adjective they use now in front of the word leader, right? Whatever he thinks, whatever he says matters a great deal. So let's start with something that he said, right? So this is what our dear friend said in 2013, right? Not too long after he came to power. He basically equated cyber weapons to be equivalent to the importance of the nuclear capability in the country. And I think I don't have to explain the importance of the nuclear program to the North Korean government, but drawing that equivalence and stating the fact that cyber is meant to thought of as like a Swiss Army knife, like an all-purpose sword, right? Meant that it's top of agenda. They're going to put resources behind it, and they're going to keep using it, right, to achieve whatever objectives they're going to try to achieve. And if we think about, if we dissect, right, what drives the Kim regime, right, it's basically down to this, like 5 things, right? And I think it warrants some, elaboration of what these 5 things are. First is about the Kims, right? So the Kims are probably the most, they are the only thriving is subjective, right? But they are the only thriving communist authoritarian regime that have basically stood the test of time, right? The Soviet Union has come to an end. I don't even know whether we consider the Chinese government to be a purist communist government today, communist governance, but very capitalist economy, right? So if a true version of communism is DPRK, and one of the primary goals, as you can imagine, is to maintain, right, the legitimacy, to maintain this bloodline, right? It's almost like Game of Thrones, right? Maintain the bloodline of the Kim family, right? Now there is this ongoing debate about whether the daughter is going to be the next, leader, right, or the sister, right? But as you have heard and seen in the news, right, the control of the Kim regime is maintained through very violent and very aggressive means, right? Purges, surveillance, intimidation. I won't say there is a lot of cyber surveillance per se, because it's a very rural, still very agricultural system. But a lot of the media output, right, increasingly through digital means, right, has that influence operations, right, element to it. So the Kim regime, right, preserving, right, the importance of the Kim regime continues to be a core interest. Next is what we know as strategic leverage, right? And the goal is primarily spearheaded by the nuclear capability, but increasingly so also supported, right, by the cyber capabilities. And when we say strategic leverage, what we mean is that the missile program is the ultimate, insurance policy for the regime, right? They fortunately or unfortunately learn from the likes of many other countries in the world that has given up their nuclear program. So think about Libya, and unfortunately Ukraine was also a similar case, right? They basically saw those historical precedents and realized that if regimes were to give up nuclear program voluntarily, they generally end up in chaos, right? They generally end up with a lot of foreign intervention, right? And the nuclear capability has also consistently showed the ability to bring superpowers to the table, right? You imagine how the North Koreans are like as a government, as a nation. You don't expect them typically to have a direct conversation with superpowers, right? With US, China, and so on and so forth. But it's primarily because of the nuclear program that basically forces, right, that conversation, right? Think about the Trump-Kim summit in Singapore. Think about the recent conversations that, Kim is invited to go shake hands at the 80th anniversary of the Communist Party, right? All this can be directly associated, right, with the fact that they have a nuclear program and they are very willing, right, to deal with political brinkmanship, right, with their nuclear program. Another core interest is, of course, economic stability. And this is where cyber plays a very big part, right? Because if you know a thing or two about the state of North Korea today, the economy is very, very heavily sanctioned. So there are only 2 key ways in which the economy in North Korea continues to stay afloat today. One is through illegal coal mining and selling the illegal coal to whoever that's willing to buy from, which is only a handful of countries. And the other, no prices for guessing, is cyber, right? Cyber single-handedly holds up, right, the revenue generation capability, the domestic economy, right, of North Korea, right, which explains, right, many of the things that they do, right, in the cyberspace. Another core interest that is important to them is the ability to maintain autonomy, right? They have these 2 key policies. I'm going to butcher this because I'm not Korean, so I apologize. But Juche and Song-un are the 2 key policies that drives the psyche, right, of the Kim regime, right? Juche, again, I apologize if I got this wrong, translates to self-reliance. Song-un translates to military first, right? And these 2 founding philosophies of the Kim nation, the Kim regime, right, drives everything and anything that the North Koreans do, right? And if you think about the Koreas from a historical perspective, they actually would state a sovereign entity for more than 900 years, right? It was only in 1910 where they were annexed by Japan, and at the end of World War II, and then from that point on till today, they were actually a divided nation. So there is this very strong, almost romantic impetus, right, to want to be the one Korea again, and they want to be autonomous again. So that drives, right, a lot of what they think they do, right, for how to position themselves as a sovereign nation and a unified Korea. Right, and then the last core interest, unification of Korea. This is the one that is a bit iffy, because the truth is, and again, I stand corrected for this because I do not represent the Korean government. I don't represent Kim. Oh no. Okay, sorry guys. In this, man. Oh. Still bad, man. Shit. Two things that I want to share with you. I bought this bottle of alcohol because I know that the RootCon norm is for every time you speak at RootCon, you get one shot. So there are 5 shots in that nasty mug. Second fun fact, I actually bought the bottle because previous years, or if you have been unfortunate, a day one speaker, you would have drank what the goons consider to be really, really harsh whiskey. So the day 2 folks are lucky because I brought 1 liter worth of really good vodka, and if it's probably your first time, you only will get 1 shot of what is a very acceptable and delicious drink. So, thanks guys. Okay, let's get back to this, but I know from experience that it will take me about 5 minutes to get the alcohol, going. So coming back to the serious topic, the topic of unification is a moving target, right? Because I do not represent either governments, but if you just take a third party's observation of how the situation has developed over time, I think we can all broadly agree that unification is not really on the cards, right? Because the South Korean government is a fully democratic, capitalist economy, very successful, very sovereign for a long time. The North Korean society is fundamentally different. The political systems are, directly opposing each other. The economical situation is fundamentally very different. So it is not actually in the interest of either the North or the South, right, to basically unify, because the economy will probably crash, right? And then if you add on the wonderful superpowers that love to be part of the party, right, I can tell you for sure that our dear friend in north of North Korea would very much want to keep North Korea as a buffer zone between what is considered a US, very pro-US, right, government, right, between them and mainland China, right? So the geopolitics, the economics just don't add up well. But nonetheless, because this has a very strong emotional appeal to both the North and the South, it's a common topic, right, that is typically used, weaponized, exploited, right, for, especially in the Kim government, right, to maintain the legitimacy of the regime, use it as a narrative, right, conveniently, right, strategically, for influence operations, for leverage, and so on and so forth. So this core interest, right, all drives, right, the 3 main modes in which cyber is leveraged, right, to achieve these objectives. I obviously am not going to go through all the campaigns that have happened over time, because that's not the purpose of this conversation. But, right, suffice to say, right, espionage, financial gain, manipulation are the 3 main ways, right, in which cyber is then employed to achieve those core interests. Now we come into the, quote-unquote, more exciting part of the conversation, right? Is that, we talked about the why, we kind of talked about the what, now we want to talk about the who, right? And the who is actually one of the toughest topics. When it comes to understanding nation states, the DPRK is one of the hardest intelligence targets to surveil on, because there's limited internet connectivity, dissidents probably get beheaded before they make it across. the border, right? So it's there are very little human sources, mostly dependent on imagery intelligence, very limited signals intelligence, and I don't think there is some CTI involved when you get, when you unfortunately respond to an incident, right, that is DPRK motivated. But to the purpose of this conversation, I wanted to unpack, right, what is the Lazarus group? And for those of you who may or may not know, sorry, the vodka. Coming back to this, right, the Lazarus group was a name that was actually came up with by this consultancy known as Novetta, that was eventually acquired by Accenture, right? So this was a term that was developed in 2016, first saw the light of day in 2016, and it was part of the analysis that was done on the attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment, right, as an outcome of the interview being released. So from that point on, it kind of stuck on, right, because many people came along the way, right, to share their knowledge about a Lazarus group or a DPRK motivated attack, but because of the lack of visibility, right, fundamentally inherent in understanding the North Koreans, they just latched on, right, to the most popular or the most public way of referring to DPRK. So everything and anything, right, became Lazarus group, right? For those of you who have worked on DPRK-based attacks, you may hear of Kim Suki, right? You may hear of all the cholimas that I will talk about from the CrowdStrike lens today. You will hear about APT-38, right? Some of the APT numbers, right? But the vast majority is like the Lazarus group. So the goal of, one of the main goals I wanted to achieve today is to really unpack who the heck is Lazarus group. So here comes the $1 million slide, right? So this is CrowdStrike's understanding of the North Korean forces, right? This is not, in any shape or form, like the 100% correct answer, because every intelligence collection capability or provider would inherently be limited to, their visibility of, right, the subject matter, right? So there's a lot that's going on here. I'm not going to be able to explain everything in detail, but I'll do my best because that is really the purpose of this conversation today, right? So the first thing that I want to spend some time talking about, let's see whether this works. I want to talk about this part, right? Because this part is relatively new. A lot of people do not necessarily know about this part. I'll talk about this part first, then I'll talk about that part, right? So within the Korean Workers' Party Central Committee, which is the political, like Politburo, right, of the North Korean government, there are obviously a good number of departments, right? But the ones that are related to cyber are primarily the munitions industry department. So this MID is actually responsible for the nuclear program, right, of the North Korean government, right? Everything from R&D, funding, staffing, the scientists, right, getting money for the program, and so on and so forth. That's what the MID is responsible for. And if you know a thing about or two, or you've been following the news about the North Korean cyber operations, the vast majority of what transpired in the last 12 to 18 months, right, were attributed to this adversary known as famous Cholima, right? In the news, you hear of it being referred to as the DPRK IT workers, right? And then in relation to this, right, there is the UFD, which is the United Front Department. This is the political department that's responsible for, quote unquote, the unification of the Korean Peninsula. So their purpose, at least overtly, is to champion for unification. And as part of this UFD, they have this thing called the Cultural Exchange Bureau. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Chinese system. The Chinese system has a very similar entity where this is where they do the foreign engagement missions. So this is where you send Chinese abroad, Koreans abroad, right, to champion for unification, right? But of course, a lot of this takes the form of espionage, takes the form of seeding human intelligence agents, right, globally, right, to serve the interests of the North Korean state. So let's look at one of the most prolific adversaries. This is the US DOJ indictment for the DPRK IT workers, right? And at CrowdStrike, we track them as famous Cholima. There will be more about famous Cholima very shortly because in one of the topics I'll talk about in terms of their TTPs, I will talk about them. But for famous Cholima, they serve the interests of the munitions department, the MID. So as you can imagine, they are financially motivated. They basically make money to fuel the nuclear program. Right? Going back to the core interest of the DPRK state, you can kind of see, right, why this matters. What is interesting about them is their modus operandi. Right? They have basically taken on social engineering to a whole new level. Right? I will talk about this in the part that I'm talking about social engineering. But for the purpose of this conversation right now, they basically are going around the world pretending to be software developers, basically somebody with some kind of data science or DevOps capability, and applying to join companies as legitimate employees. So the point here is, if you actually work for the human resource department or the talent acquisition department of an organization, you want to keep your ears really open, eyes really open to look out for the likes of a famous Cholima operator. And believe it or not, the Philippines is one of the biggest hit nations by this particular operator. I'm not lying, because you will see about that very shortly. So coming back to this, the money slide. Right? We will now, sorry about that. Back this slide. Right? Now we will just talk about, like, my animations are not working. Okay, but basically now we'll talk about this part, right? This part that is most well known as the RGB, the Bureau 121, the Lazarus group, right? So we will unpack, right, each one of them, right? So the RGB, right, the Reconnaissance General Bureau, it was something that the current Kim, when he assumed power in 2009, he created this entity, right? And he also created what was eventually known as Bureau 121 or Office 121. And the reason why the Lazarus group has such a ring or has a, enduring legacy is because most of the early attacks that I talked about, right, the 11 Days of Rain, Duxo, Sony, WannaCry, they were all attributed to the Lazarus group, right? So they were all attributed to the RGB, the Reconnaissance General Bureau, or Bureau 121. Of course, over time, they go through reorganizations. In fact, since the creation in 2009, they have gone through 2 reorganizations. This is the current understanding of what makes up this bureau, right? There is this bureau known as Bureau 325. It's very interesting, at least in my opinion, because this was formed relatively recently. It was formed during the height of the COVID pandemic. And based on what we know today, it is actually consists of the technical talents that are directly coming out of the university system in North Korea. And the mandate was to go after healthcare technology, vaccine-related information, right? So it's directly tied to the contextual circumstances, right, of when it was formed. As of today, CrowdStrike has not seen any units that can be attributed back to Bureau 325, but we know that it exists, right? And then there is the 110 Research Institute, right, which is, again, right, where you see the vast majority of where the quote-unquote Lazarus group activity is coming out from. We'll talk more about that very shortly. And then we have this thing called Office 970. This was first made public in a report by the UN in 2023. And in the UN report, which is available publicly, so you can read it, it says that Kim Suki, which CrowdStrike tracks as Velvet Cholima, actually is Office 970. We have no information that corroborates or confirms that, which is why we still park Velvet Cholima with the 63 or the Office of 91. Right? So this is where sort of things are. 414 is also relatively new. We have no evidence to assign any Cholimas to them, but we know that there's some cyber capabilities that exist within the 414. But let's look at some of the actual adversaries, right? So there is first and foremost what is known as Labyrinth Cholima. If you have been doing this for a long time, if you hear Lazarus Group, for example, right, or things like Moonstone Sleet, which is the Microsoft current nomenclature, right, or if you hear things like APTC 26, which is the Qihu Chinese vendors reference to this, right? It all refers to the same adversary. They are probably the most long-standing and the most prolific Korean-based adversary. So when people say Lazarus Group, about 80% of the attacks by Lazarus Group is actually Labyrinth Cholima. And I'm not going to go deep, take a deep dive on them. They are already very popular. what is most interesting about them is that they are a dual mission adversary. So they do both political espionage, some degree of economic espionage, but they also support the revenue generation capability. So they are basically very capable, right? And they are also very big, because over time, as we observe the activities that we can attribute to Labyrinth Cholima, there are some where, they basically vary in terms of complexity and sophistication. So this generally also gives us an assessment that the group is actually really, really big. Then we have Silent Cholima. This is a very espionage-centric adversary. You may also hear of this as being referred to as APT-45, or also heard as Andrerial, right? This is the adversary that has been active for a really long time and is primarily focused on espionage. It focuses collection on government and military entities. So as you can imagine, right, they are typically focused on targeting entities in South Korea, right? And they have a very long-standing history of using a common tool. So this also means that they are a lot more deliberate, a lot more long-form, right, in their development cycles. Then we have Stardust Cholima. This is the adversary that is behind the infamous Lazarus heist, right? So when we say the Lazarus heist, it is actually Stardust Cholima, right, or Blunarov, right, or Sapphire Sleep, right, that's actually behind the attack that targeted the Bangladesh bank heist. And they are, by far, the adversary amongst the DPRK ecosystem that is squarely focused on revenue generation operations. So the ones that are hitting the cryptocurrency exchanges, the ones that are targeting the banks, right? If you work for a bank, or you work for a fintech, or you work for a cryptocurrency exchange, you better have Stardust Cholima, right, on your radar. And then there's Ricochet Cholima, right? This is the one that exclusively targets South Korea, right? They are also known as APT-37. They are also known as Pearl Sleet, right? And they are relatively small in terms of the volume and the signature of the attacks that they conduct, but they are squarely focused on the South Korean as a target, right? Whether is it about espionage, whether is it about intelligence, whether is it economic or political espionage, right? Ricochet Cholima is the adversary to look out for if you work or serve or in collaboration, right, with the Korean government, for example. And then we have Velvet Cholima, right? Velvet Cholima is also known as Kimsuki. So if you are interested in Kimsuki, you are interested in APT-43, right? This Admiral Sleet, this is the adversary that you should be concerned about. They've been around for a really, really long time. They generally are focused on collecting intelligence on peninsula-related issues. So remember I talked about the unification of the peninsula as a key interest, right? Velvet Cholima is sort of like you can think of this as like the adversary that is squarely focused on that target mission set. Right? So now that we have understood, right, a better understanding of that money slide, I just want to spend the next few moments just quickly talking about some of the recent tactics, techniques, and procedures that are unique to the North Korean government, and also, something for you to keep an eye out for, right, if you have identified some of these adversaries to be potentially targeting your organization. First, I'll begin with social engineering, right? I don't know if you guys know about this, but if you look at across the board, all the nation states, I think it's suffice to say that the North Koreans are probably the most innovative, right? And they play really, really strong in the space of social engineering. They were the ones that weaponized and exploited social media to perform social engineering attacks, right, in many different shapes, way, or form. And they continue to evolve, they continue to iterate on their tactics and techniques, right, exploiting social media over time, right? So if you have been watching this space for a while now, about 3 years ago, you would probably have heard about, the classic DPRK move, right, where they will pretend to be a recruiter, and then they'll reach out to you and ask you if you are interested in a job, right, as a developer, as a data scientist, as somebody that works in one of the spaces that they are typically targeting. Right, then after that, what typically happens is that they will ask you to move the conversation to a direct messaging platform, and then they will send you either a job description, that takes the form of a PDF, or they will send you a test, right? A proficiency test that is a GitHub link, right? Where you go to the GitHub link where the test is hosted, and then you proceed to perform the test, right? Either of those, as you can imagine, turns out to be the lure, right, for a secondary payload, right, to follow. Even that has changed over time. So let me give you an example. Previously, you would see this, right? You will see a lot of LinkedIn profiles that will behave like a recruiter, like a talent acquisition person trying to convince you to take a job. And what typically follows after that is some kind of crypto mining software or some kind of primary payload that they drop, right? And then they'll collect either personal data, credentials, or they will drain your cryptocurrency wallet if a wallet exists. But what has changed is that now this kind of LinkedIn profiles have also started to take hold. This type of LinkedIn profiles are the ones that you would see most closely associated with your DPRK IT workers, right? Or famous Cholima. Because now this fits the other side of the same coin. Now they are trying to join organizations as legitimate employees, earn a quote-unquote honest salary, and funnel 80% of the salary back to the missile program, right, in North Korea. And as you can imagine, generative AI, right? I've been avoiding this wonderful topic for a long time now, but like I mentioned, if you are serious about social engineering, you would 100% leverage generative AI, right, to improve your tactics, techniques, and procedures. So I'm not going to talk through these slides because I think a picture or a video speaks 1,000 words. I'll give you guys an actual view of how things look like today. So let me try to get this going. I hope this actually works now. Can we get the sound? Can we get the sound? Sorry, I promise this is good. So,
as your background goes, I have your resume up. It looks like your last role was at Netflix, but you're no longer there. Is that right?
I am no longer with Netflix.
Okay. And what was your reason for leaving Netflix?
So 3 months ago, I had a family issue, so I had to leave Netflix. But now, family issue resolved successfully, so yeah, I'm looking for new position.
Just out of curiosity, Richard, what made you leave Salesforce?
In this company, my contract was expired by last month, so right now I am unemployed.
And what is your current work authorization status in the US?
I'm a citizen.
Got it.
Hey, Andrew, before I forget, can you just hold up your ID to the camera so I can just verify it really quick? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just traveling, so I have my driver's license on my at home. So if it is possible, I will show my driver license next time.
Can you confirm your current address?
Dunwoody, Georgia.
Okay.
I'll stop there for now because this goes on for a while. But what you basically have just seen is actual famous Cholima operators performing their job interviews to join legitimate tech companies, right? In the likes of Salesforce, the likes of Netflix, right? In the US and so on and so forth. And if you were wondering, who they are or what they are deepfake generated videos, right? That happens in real time. And if you can recall one of the personas, when they were asked to prove their physical identity, they came up with some excuse about the fact that they do not have their driver's license with them at a particular point in time, right? So this is a very common tactic, right? So it's interesting because when I talk about famous Cholima, people think that who should be listening would be the cybersecurity practitioners, but actually that's not the case, right? Because it should be the HR folks, the talent acquisition folks, that will be the frontline sensors, right? To suss out these potential operators that are out there trying to make their way in as a legitimate employee. And
so as far as your background,
this is how bad it is, right? Look at, do you see the word Philippines, right? I'm sure you do, right? So this is the targeting statistics that we have associated with famous Cholima as of just last week, right? This is the sector breakdown of who famous Cholima or what industries famous Cholima is going after. And these are the countries, right, that are most unfortunately hit. And if you can't see, but like the Philippines is basically right here. So it is a problem, right? And again, if you, just to reiterate this point, if you think that your organization is within the targeting scope of the famous Cholima operators or the DPRK IT workers, if you are a cybersecurity practitioner today, please do your organization, your company a favor. Find your HR person, find your talent acquisition person, and have a conversation with them about famous Cholima, because the threat is very real. Another notable tactic and technique to be concerned about is this very directed and specific ability to target the Mac OS environment. For those of us who have been doing security for a while, you would know that vast majority of the targeting goes after Windows, right? Because of how much it has proliferated. But if you take a step back and think for a moment and think about who the North Koreans would typically go after, right, to achieve their core interests, you would quickly be able to conclude that the industries that they're going after typically love to use the Mac machines, right? And for that reason, they have come very prepared over time. So if you look at this is Labyrinth Cholima's tooling. Look at the number of ticks that they have on all the different malware frameworks that they have that is specifically designed to target the Mac OS, and compare this with the Windows, with the Linux machines. Right? Another example I have here, Stardust Cholima, the one that's going after cryptocurrency exchanges, financial technology startups, right? Your financially motivated revenue generation operations. The vast majority of their current tooling is focused on the Mac OS. And last but not least, supply chain compromisers, right? Whether is it about targeting or compromising GitHub, repositories, or going after upstream supply chain vendors or partners, right? This has increasingly been the way the North Koreans have gone and developed the capability to go after a large swath of targets, right? And I don't know if you know this, but generally speaking, if an adversary is able to perform supply chain attacks, it demonstrates a level of sophistication in order to achieve that level of attack, right? And Labyrinth Cholima as an example, right? The most famous entity of the Lazarus group, they were the first, right, in 2023 to be publicly observed to have used a supply chain attack, right? They leveraged what is known as the 3CX video conferencing software. So not too dissimilar to like a Zoom type software. And they used that to actually distribute malware in the target environment. And how they achieved this was not through a direct compromise of 3CX. They actually compromised the parent company of 3CX. So they actually targeted the trading technology, a company that is Trading Technologies, which is a fintech parent company of 3CX. And then from there, they pivoted, they compromised the application of 3CX, and then they used that to deploy information stealers, right? To steal credentials, personal data, right? To follow on with a secondary payload. And for effect, I talked about famous Cholima quite a fair bit already today, right? So we spend a lot of time talking about what's here, right? The video, the deep fakes, the social engineering, right? They all reside in this IT worker aspect of the campaigns. But when you look at the malware operations, right? Beavertail, Invincible Ferret, right? Which is the primary payload that they typically use in their attacks. Many of these Beavertail and Invincible Ferret, there is a direct infection route, but there's also a supply chain attack route to it. So even a contemporary, very relevant adversary like famous Cholima leverages supply chain compromisers techniques, right, to achieve their malware operations. So coming to the last section of my presentation today, it's really to kind of bring us back to this conversation and think about what does all this, right, mean for me. Remember I mentioned after I did a quick history class, right, that the vast majority, right, of the attacks that we see that are attributed to the North Koreans can be, they fall within, right, these three main categories. They do some level of political espionage, right, to inform their foreign policy, to maintain their core interests of the survivability of the Kim regime, to maintain strategic leverage on their adversaries and their allies. You have industrial espionage, right? I talked about Bureau 325 that came about during the COVID pandemic, right? To steal medical information, vaccine information, to help them with the pandemic locally within North Korea. a lot of industrial espionage also drives the nuclear program in North Korea, stealing satellite communication data, stealing, actual missile armament type data, right, to help them improve, right, their missile systems. And then, of course, revenue generation, right, the money, right, going where the money is. So this is probably the second $1 million slide, right? So if you are wondering why the hell I've been going on for the last 50 minutes, this is why, right? If you belong to any of these sectors, right, maybe more so in the industrial espionage and the revenue piece, if you belong to any of these industries, you should at least, right, be aware, or if ideally deliberately introduce the North Korean adversaries or the trolleymers that I've talked about into your threat model, right? Because if you belong to any of this, you should be prepared to have a target on your back where you can expect very much the trolleymers to go after your organization as a potential target. And in the case of the Philippines, you have seen the famous trolleymers slide, the targeting slide that I've alluded to earlier. You guys are on the top 5 target list of famous trolleymers. So the threat is very, very, very real, right? So if you belong to any of these industries, what can you actually do? I promise this is the last slide, right? You want to kind of take a deeper dive, right? And really get to know your adversary. And when we say what it takes to get to know your adversary, it is this, right? Understanding how the adversary, from an end-to-end perspective, would target your organization. Whether is it using some form of custom tooling that's associated to them, or some kind of living off the land, like famous, like popular living off the land binaries, right? Your Loy bins that they will use to perform their attacks. You want to be able to keep an eye out of them. So if the trolleymers are part of your threat model, you want to think about modeling their attacks, right? Either with the MITRE ATT&CK framework or with the Lockheed Martin Q chain. And then you want to actively introduce detection rules, threat hunting efforts directed at looking and hunting for these adversaries proactively, right? So with that, I'm sorry I droned on for 53 minutes and 56 seconds, but I blame the 5 minutes on the 5 shots of vodka. But I hope you take a thing or two away from my presentation today. If you'd like to learn more about the DPRK ecosystem, I'm going to be hanging around for the rest of the day. Please look me up. I'm happy to have a conversation. And here's to an awesome rest of RootCon 19. Thank you very much.
Cool. Awesome stuff as always, Aaron. Thank you so much. Okay, so if you have questions, feel free to find Aaron all over the conference. And so we'll move on with our next speaker. But while he's setting up,